Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Yamini Atmavilas. I work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and one of the areas we support is IGC on this work supporting evidence to policy in Bihar. And so I'm really glad to see that this panel is coming together in this workshop where we're focused on gender, skills, and migration. My own background is in gender equality, and so I'm pretty thrilled to be here. And I will bite my tongue every time I feel like I have something to say, because I'm on this panel with people I have learned so much from. So without much ado, I'm going to make a few quick remarks just to set the context and then introduce our speakers and hand it off to them. We know that there's been a lot of discussion in India on labor force participation and women's economic empowerment, discussions on the economy, discussions on migration, on skilling, what's happening with youth, and where do we actually see increases in jobs and in productivity. So it's such a timely panel to have today, where we have focus on both employment as well as skilling, and what some of those future trends are and what some policy questions are going to be. As you know, India has some of the lowest female labor force participation in the world, according to the latest PLFS survey, and we've seen declining trends, but at the same time we're seeing some interesting increases in regular work, but then also increases in self-employed work. So what we see is this trend of a lot of aspiration for work and a lot of work participation, but then it's largely in informal sector. So a lot of any statistic that you might see on work participation in India, whether it's national or from even ILO stats, for example, you would see that 80 to 85% of those who work in India are in the informal sector. So that's sort of setting the context for what we're trying to sort of address and see what some of our speakers have been trying to work on, and where they see both challenges as well as opportunities to change this. One of the things that we can't miss also in this scenario is the youth bulge, or what we called for a long time the demographic dividend. And of course, that we've been talking about it for about 20 years now, and we see that in some states the demographic dividend no longer holds. So states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, the southern states where fertility is falling, you do see less of a youth bulge, but in the larger states like Bihar, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, you see where you have high fertility and larger populations, there's still another 15 to 20 years where the demographic dividend can be capitalized on. And so this is a really important thing to bear in mind, that we do see these large demographic shifts, but they're also very spatially organized. And so that also gives us then very specific questions that we must answer for states as well as geographies, and understand what those states' policy contexts are and what could the recommendations for those very specific states might be. So with that, I'm going to just welcome you to this session, and I'd like to just note, I've been asked to let you know that you can tweet via hashtag IndiaGrowth19, so a good reminder. And with that, this panel will discuss evidence around the causes of low female labor force participation, drivers of migration, as well as what policy windows exist for skilling, as well as the creation of good jobs. We'll begin with a presentation by one of our panelists, Purva Khera, who's on my far right, from the IMF on the macroeconomic implications of gender inequality and informality in India. This kind of will set the context for the kinds of challenges that we're going to be discussing. And then we'll have two presentations by Farzana and by Clément around female labor force participation, looking at both gender norms as well as other barriers that Farzana has been doing research on, and Clément will speak about what his research is telling us about skilling programs and what are some ways that one could actually nudge use of them, but also ensure retention of youth in the skilling and the skill to work transitions. And finally, I'll be asking Subhalakshmi Nandi, Director of Policy at ICRW, to consider the presentations in light of the policy environment, but also I would say knowing her in light of what's happening with women's economic empowerment, broader changes, and what some of the newer policy opportunities might look like. So let me invite Purva. Purva is an economist at the International Monetary Fund. Her research focuses on building macroeconomic general equilibrium models for policy analysis. She's got deep knowledge on gender analysis and economics and has been engaged with assessing the macroeconomic impact of gender inequality and informality with a focus on India. She holds a PhD and MPhil in economics from Cambridge. Purva will speak about macroeconomic implications of gender inequality and informality in India. You've got 10 minutes, Purva.
Thank you. So today I will be presenting my research paper, as Yamini said. It's titled Macroeconomic Implications of Gender Inequality and Informality in India. It's a IMF working paper which you can find online. So this paper analyzes the impact of various gender-based policies and labor market policies on women's labor market outcomes and macroeconomic activity in India. And when I say women's labor market outcomes, I not only mean their participation rates in the labor market, but also their quality of employment, which Yamini touched on a bit in terms of whether they get formally employed versus informally, and also the impact of policies on their wages and gender wage gaps. When I say macroeconomic impact, I'll be focusing on three key variables, which is the impact of such policies on GDP, on unemployment, and on the share of the formal versus the informal economy. So first, coming to why this study is relevant to India, and Yamini touched on a few of these points. So India has the third lowest female labor force participation rate in South Asia after Pakistan and Afghanistan. It is 1/3 of male labor force participation, and what is more worrying is that it has been declining over time. So it fell from 34% in 1999-2000 to approximately 24% now in 2018, according to the periodic labor force survey. So one may ask, why are we seeing this? So according to microeconomic evidence, women face both supply side and demand side constraints. So in terms of supply side constraints, in terms of women participating, among others, social norms, safety and mobility issues, and the lack of public provisions such as childcare, healthcare, etc., lead to women participating less in the labor market and spending a lot of time doing house-related work. On the demand side, in terms of their employment, they tend to have lower education levels on average, so lower skills. Also, there is some degree of discrimination in employment against female workers, and lack of decent formal job opportunities is also a big driving factor. So what do I mean by lack of decent formal job opportunities? So more than 90% of workers in India are employed informally. And according to the Economic Survey 2015-16, informal sector jobs are inferior to formal sector jobs. So formal sector employment pays 20 times more wages than informal jobs. Informal workers tend to work longer hours, have no social protection, have no job protection. What is also worrying is that the new jobs being created in the formal sector have also been largely informal in nature. And on top of all of this, women tend to be employed more informally in comparison to males. So less than 20% of workers in the formal sector are actually females, according to the Economic Survey. So again, why such a big informal sector in India? So according to microeconomic evidence, again, a big driving factor are strict labor force regulations in formal labor markets in India. So in India, there are more than 250 labor laws at the center and state levels, which makes it very difficult for firms to fire workers. There are very strong labor unions. Even to set up a formal firm, getting environment clearances, land acquisition, etc. is so difficult that it discourages people to function formally. On top of all of this, women are paid less wages for equal work, have lower average years of schooling, spend 30 times more at home work in comparison to males, and have higher unemployment rates as well. So why should policymakers care about all of this? In other words, what is the macro relevance of women's labor market outcomes? This is where the contribution of my paper comes in, where I build a comprehensive macroeconomic model consisting of both formal and informal sector and male and female workers. So just to give you an idea of how the model works, there's a household. It consists of both male and females. They decide whether they want to participate in the labor market or stay at home. Now, this decision to participate or stay at home depends on, as we discussed earlier, on social norms, on the safety and mobility, on public provisions, infrastructure, etc. So, in the initial equilibrium at the start of the model, we assume women face more safety and mobility concerns, have lower intra-household bargaining power. So what we see is that they tend to stay more at home. So you would see males participating more, which is what the data tells us. Then the ones who participate, both males and females, they can get employed either formally, informally, or they stay unemployed. Now, whether they get formal employment versus informal depends on the extent of regulatory costs in the formal sector. So again, in the initial equilibrium, we assume that these regulatory costs in the formal sector are very high. So you would see a larger share of workers getting employed informally. Now, whether these firms hire male or female workers, that depends on the skill levels of these two types of workers, as well as the extent of discrimination against any gender type. So again, in the initial equilibrium, we assume that females have lower skills and that there is discrimination against them. So we would see that more females are employed informally or they remain unemployed in comparison to males. So once we have this initial setup, we look at the impact under 3 different policies. One is a gender-based policy where we look at what happens if females have higher safety. Second is a labor market reform policy where we'll see what happens when there's lower regulatory costs in the formal sector. And the third one would be a combination of the two of these. So what happens when women have higher safety and mobility? In this model, this translates into 10% more likelihood of females to choose work over staying at home. So the good news is, yes, that female labor force participation increases, which is good for growth, so GDP increases. However, what we see is that majority of the increased female labor participants either get employed informally in low-paying jobs or they stay unemployed. And why is that happening? That's because of the high regulatory costs in the formal sector, so we don't see enough formal sector job creation for it to absorb these increased female labor participants. So then let's look at the impact of lower regulatory costs. So in this model, that translates into 10% less costs for formal sector firms to hire or fire workers. Again, the good news is it leads to much more formal job creation, so overall formality in the labor market increases. Both males and benefits share of formal employment increases. However, again, what we see is that males end up benefiting more, so males' share of formal employment increases by much more than females, which actually worsens gender gaps in the labor market. And again, why? That's because, as we touched upon earlier, that women still face those supply and demand constraints in the labor market. So firms still prefer to hire males over females. So then we say, okay, let's combine these two policies. So if females have higher safety, they participate more, so their participation goes up. And now, because there are lower regulatory costs in the formal sector, you see that there are formal sector jobs being created. So women who are participating more are able to find formal sector, high-paying formal jobs. Males also find formal jobs because of lower regulatory costs in the formal sector. And we see that they have higher incomes, higher consumption, and so GDP goes up by much more. So what are the policy implications? So when it comes to women's economic inclusion, a more holistic strategy is needed. So in terms of women's labor market inclusion, gender-based reforms should be implemented simultaneously with labor market reforms, which are absolutely necessary in the case of India. So to conclude, I would say that policies should first target getting females outside the house, so making sure they participate in the labor market, which can be done by making sure that they have enough safety and mobility by providing enough adequate infrastructure and public provisions, and at the same time making sure that there are enough formal jobs being created, and that can only come from lower labor market regulations, and that females are able to access these jobs. So, and that can happen through appropriate skill training, through promoting higher education levels among females, and also through stricter implementation of anti-discriminatory laws. Thank you.
Thanks, Purva. We'll now move on to Farzana Afridi, who will talk to us about raising women's participation in the economy. What will it take? Farzana is an associate professor of economics at the Indian Statistical Institute. She's led a well-known IGC study using NSS data to investigate the trend of falling female labor force participation in rural India. She's lots of interesting research going on. Sorry, it will take a moment on around women's economic empowerment associated with the Initiative for What Works to Advance Women and Girls in the Economy, a program funded by the foundation. Her presentation today will focus on the constraints of labor force participation among women, both on the demand and supply side, and what might be done to address these constraints and enhance labor participation. She'll draw on her IGC research as well as some of her iWage work on the impact of LPG usage for cooking instead of traditional fuels on women's time use. Over to you, Farzana.
Great. Thank you so much, Yamini, and it's great to be here. Thank you to IGC for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different studies here that are complete and also ongoing, and these will also echo some of the things that Purva just mentioned in her talk just now. So, what Purva was talking about is very nicely sort of highlighted in this graph over here. So, what you see is a bunch of countries which are low income, middle income and high income countries, and India essentially falls in those, it's amongst those blue dots over there. And if you try to fit a line with per capita GDP and labor force participation, proportion of women who are participating in the labor market, what you see is that labor force participation of women is low at, or rather, sort of high at low income levels, dips when you are a middle income country, and then rises again when you become a high income country. So where is India there? So where India is an outlier. So given the level of per capita GDP that India has, the labor force participation rate of women should be higher. So it should be on that, on the gray line. So it's much lower than what it should be. And if you thought that by increasing women's education, for example, India could perform better, again, if you look by education, what we see is that India again is an outlier. So for given levels of education, the proportion of women who have at least secondary levels of education, India is again an outlier in the sense that the labor force participation rates of women is lower than what it should be for countries with similar levels of educational attainment of women. So it's pretty much clear that whatever we are doing is not good enough given the GDP per capita levels at which India is, or given the educational attainment of women. So going forward from here, and I just want to go over this briefly. So some of the work that I done earlier was essentially highlighting the fact that there are specific demographic groups where you are seeing this low level of female labor force participation as well as the decline. So if you look at this over here in this picture, we've broken it up by rural and urban areas, and essentially what you see is that the decline, which is, this is using NSS data, is happening in rural areas where it is essentially stagnant. Women's labor force participation is essentially stagnant in urban areas. And then which groups are these where you see this happening? The decline that we've witnessed in the last few years, in the last few decades, has essentially been happening again amongst currently married women. So it is the women who are the largest proportion of the demographic group amongst the 15 to 65 age group, and majority of women in that age group in India are married. So what is it that is causing this low level as well as the decline for this particular demographic group is what we were trying to understand. And if you look at it again in terms of the obverse, the opposite of labor force participation, then it is how much time are they spending at home. And so if we use the NSS data as well as the time use surveys, what you see is that there's a decline. So the previous graph showed you that there's a decline in the time spent in the market. And this one is showing you that there's an increase in the time spent on domestic work at home for the same demographic group. So there's a substitution potentially going on between market work and work at home. So you're withdrawing from the market, but you're spending more time at home, right? So, and this is very interesting. So if you just look at the, on the left-hand side, you have the graph for market work, and on the right-hand side, you have the graph for domestic work, and this is taken from time use data. So essentially, it's telling you the proportion of time that husbands and wives are spending at home versus the market. And you see the blue and the red lines flip between the men and the women. So the gap that you have between the market work, the time spent on market work by men and women. So it's really low for women. So the blue line is low, and then the red line is high on the left-hand side. And then it flips when you look at domestic work. So men essentially are spending almost 0 hours per week on domestic work. It's very low, whereas women are spending up to 50 hours per week on domestic work. And there lies the story of what women are doing with their time. Essentially, what we want to highlight here is that the cultural norms related to the gender division of labor, which is much more predominant in developing countries. For, if you look at the OECD data, for example, then you'll see that there is a gap. There is a gender gap, certainly, even in the developed countries. But this gap is much more massive when you look at developing countries, when you look at transition countries, right? So this non-substitutability, which is imposed by these cultural norms. So the norm is that it is the responsibility of the woman to take on care work, to take on domestic work, ensures that there is this less substitutability between the two types of labor at home, and also makes women's time much more elastic in the sense that, you would want to adjust women's work hours at home and in the market as opposed to the man's, right? So what is interesting is, what we want to talk about here is, given these cultural norms, and of course we can chip away at these norms. There are now very interesting studies which would tell us that you might want to change these norms, and they might be successful, especially when you target children when they're younger and when they're at home, and you also involve men in this. But given these norms, what is the role of technology essentially in terms of the work that women are doing at home in releasing potentially women's time at home? So we have this work which has been going on in a randomized controlled trial that we are running in Madhya Pradesh on raising awareness on the health aspects of using solid fuels for cooking. And this ties up with the flagship program that the government has been working on, which is the Ujjwala program. And we're collecting time use data for this, and what we find is that having an LPG connection reduces the time that women are spending on working at home for doing unpaid work, and releases the time for market work, particularly for women who are more destitute and who need to work. So that is up to 30 minutes per day, and this includes just the cooking time, but also the amount of time that it takes for collecting fuel and so on. And so what suggesting here is that there can be simple technological changes through policy which can induce adopting not just clean technology, but also technology which releases time for women at home. And if you look at the demand side constraints, and if you wanted to think about increasing women's education and potentially making work more accessible to them, what we find in our work is that when education increases, productivity at home also increases, right? So you have higher returns in the labor market, but you also potentially have higher returns within the home. And so when we sort of plot the relative returns from the market, which is the red line, then that is increasing very slowly, but the relative returns relative to illiterate increases massively to home production when education increases. And this big gap is something that has to be bridged. So until and unless labor market returns keep up with the returns that you get from home production activities, from domestic work, you're not going to be able to induce women to leave work at home and go and work in the market, right? So when we're looking again on easing demand side constraints, then some qualitative work that we've been doing in Delhi's industrial areas tell us that most women don't want to work in factories. Of our sample of about 1,500 women that we talked to who are around these industrial areas, only 1% of these women said that the preferred job would be in factories. And the reason for that is that there is this very poor regulation of labor standards, there's lack of principle of equal remuneration for equal work, and there is a lack of skills, so they are most often working in the lowest paying jobs within these factories. So just to conclude then, I think we, again, what Purva said was that we need a very holistic perspective. We need to think of the demand side constraints. And of course, there are also supply side constraints. And there are simple policy measures that can be undertaken to release the time that women have at home, given these social norms and these constraints. At the same time, we need reforms to ensure that women are getting decent jobs at a decent pay. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzana. I now invite Clément for his presentation on gender, labor markets and migration. Clément is Assistant Professor of Economics at University of Warwick, and his research focuses on governance and labor markets, specifically on the implementation of labor market effects of social programs. He was also a postdoc research fellow at Nuffield College at Oxford and received his PhD from the Paris School of Economics. Over to you, Clément.
Thank you. So I was saying one unique thing about working on gender is that you can be a white male and still be the minority on the panel. So here I am. I guess as compared to the previous presentations, which were very ambitious and we're reporting on very serious work, I'll be mostly giving you a few descriptive statistics and a few thoughts about how policy can influence, how labor market programs, labor market policy can influence female labor force participation. As I was preparing those slides, I went into a rant that's, I know, is echoed widely in the public debate in India right now about the unavailability of nationally representative data on employment, labor markets, and especially migration. And it's really sad to see that the Census 2011 data on migration hasn't been released yet. So if you have any thoughts on how to get it out, much appreciated. So I'll start with something that Farzana has talked about. I guess my graph is simple. I'm not looking at all at the change. I'm just looking at in 2011-12 at the share of time spent in the labor force for men and women. And I've done it by rural and urban because I'll be talking a bit about migration, about the move from rural to urban areas. From the look of it, really, there's no difference basically between what the labor force participation of rural women and urban women, which was quite striking because they actually do different things. And if you look at what male, so as a comparison, what male adults, so I'm focusing throughout on 18 to 35, so relatively younger adults, do in rural areas. So male adults do a lot of self-employment, casual labor, so informal work, and a bit of salaried work, formal work. And women do pretty much the same, so in terms of representation, except that all the levels are much lower, which suggests that there are constraints in their participation to the labor market that are somehow orthogonal to the type of demand that's out there, which maybe emphasizes the supply side point. On the urban side, it's, again, the men are doing different things as compared to rural areas. So more salaried work, more formal employment, less casual work, less informal employment. And the women are pretty much, have the same relative proportions in these different activities, except that the levels are lower. So one thing I wanted to, to think about is, okay. So sorry. So there's a last bar that you can't quite make out, which is public works. Okay, and I've spent quite a bit of time working on the NAREGA, or the Employment Guarantee, however you might want to call it. And this is a very large public works program, and it is offering equal employment opportunities to men and women. That is, men and women are paid the same, and actually there are targets, quotas for women to participate into this work. The good news is the quotas are not even needed. The women are very massively participating into this program. This is 2011-12. So here I'm zooming in on this very small bar and showing you that for among rural adults, the participation in public works, which is basically what this program is doing, is almost equal for male and women and female. Okay? However, so it's impressive, but I zoomed out on a very small bar. So it's not going to change dramatically labor force participation of women. The other thing I wanted to focus on is migration. And if you look at the data, there is a lot of migration of women. And of course, knowing the Indian context, women move to get married. Okay? And it's not because you move to get married that you have not to work at wherever you go. Okay? So what I'm looking at here is the fact that migration is much higher for women, especially in rural areas. But if you look at the labor force participation in conjunction with migration, you see that most women who migrate then are not in the labor force. And that comes back to the fact that most of them are just married and they stop. Okay, so on the face of it, migration, although you might think that rural women are constrained in their ability to get to employment opportunities, on the face of it, migration itself is not helping them doing so. However, and that's some recent work I wanted to share with you, there are many programs currently working on, I call it a new approach to rural development. It's indeed a strange way of approaching rural development, which is to say, instead of making things happen in rural areas, let's try to help the young escape and move to urban areas. But in fact, what these programs do, and I'm focusing here on one of the flagship programs of the current government, the DDU-GKY, is to get young, unskilled rural workers into urban jobs, and it's quite a large-scale program. The focus is on formal employment, okay? The focus is on salaried wage work. So those are relatively good jobs, and to come back to, I think, what Purva was talking about, those are probably the jobs we want to encourage. I won't go into whether or not jobs are being created there. The main focus, I think, of these programs is social inclusions, is to make sure that women, and also SC/ST, but here I'll focus on women too get to have access to those urban jobs and to those good jobs in urban areas. And I'll be reporting on some study in Orissa, joint with Apurav Bhatia and Roland Ratlo, funded by JPAL, ESRC, and the partnership was with the state of Orissa. What we did was to survey all the trainees of a given training provider for a year. So we enrolled them all in the study, and we followed them for 12 months. And we thought the news was, I think, for a start, pretty good for the program. So if you look at the retention rate, and I think every policymakers we've met said, oh, it's terrible, they don't want these jobs, they just drop out like flies. Yes, they do drop out, but after, as you see, after 12 months, they still are between, maybe it depends what your priors are, between 25% and 50% of the people are still in the job they were placed in. That's the first knowledge. So they're moving people to jobs that, a decent fraction of them want. What's really interesting, I wanted to put the emphasis on, is that women value this job more. They're more likely to stay in those jobs. And I can tell you this is not because they're being placed in better jobs or better paying jobs. It's quite the opposite, actually. They're mostly doing textile factory work. That's quite hard. So what this figure suggests is that women do value those jobs. And when you know, and I've shown you a bit what's happening in the labor market at large, you know that they don't have that many opportunities, and definitely not a migration formal job opportunity. That's very hard to come by for women, and that's how we interpret the fact that they stay in those jobs. And the news is even better for the program if you extend the focus to not only the particular job they've been placed in, but salaried work or formal work at large, because they might transition to another job of the same kind with a different employer. And from the point of view of policy, of the objective of the policy, it's definitely worth it. And so what we see is that after 12 months, there's at least 50% of male trainees that are still in the job. And those who've dropped out, are basically most of them are looking for jobs. And if you look at the women, it's a bit more than 50%. And many of them go back home and do this domestic work we were talking about. So it's literally the half empty, half full glass here. So after 12 months, 50% of them are still in this job. That's really a unique employment opportunity for them. And 50% are back to, unfortunately, labor market as usual for women, which is home and doing domestic work. So, but I think I'll end on a more optimistic note and say that labor market participation of women is low in rural and urban areas, but we've seen one policy, one in rural areas, that's increasing labor force participation for women. So when you give them equal employment opportunities, they do take advantage of them. Migration in itself doesn't seem to be a game changer for women, but when it's organized in an employment program that gives access, like DDU-GKY, that gives training and ties up workers with an employer, it does seem that women take up those jobs and value them. And there's ongoing work, and I had to say this because it's funded by IGC, so we have Bihar, we have ongoing work in Bihar thinking about aspiration and take-up of this program and retention in this program, and with some interventions that we hope will help trainees make the most of the program. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Clément. And I'm going to now invite our first discussant, Subhalakshmi Nandi. She's Director of Policy at ICRW. She's had broad experience in connecting research with social policy and grassroots action, has published quite a bit, and is very active on issues of unpaid work, rights of women farmers, social protection, and women's education and engendering microfinance. She has worked with UN Women and women's rights organizations for almost 2 decades on diverse issues of gender equality and rights. Also had a brief stint at the UN headquarters in New York as policy specialist at the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. So I'm going to invite Subhalakshmi, and we're going to see if she's a glass half full or a glass half empty girl.
Thanks, Yamini, and thanks to IGC for having me here. I'll just speak from here. I do want to give a caveat that I'm not an economist, and I think some of my reflections that come as a feminist researcher and practitioner, I will also do my best to center them around the voices of marginalized women that I have heard in the field. Thank you. It was really interesting and a very interesting mix of different presentations. I wanted to just highlight 2 or 3 themes that for me seem to be coming out from the presentations and that I think have policy implications for us moving forward for women's economic empowerment. I think the first that I wanted to highlight, and I think we heard in every presentation, is the choice of work. What is really available out there for women and how do they make these choices? And we heard that a lot of it has to do with gender norms within households, the nature of jobs, the conditions of the work. I think all of these are factors that we must keep in mind that drive women to choose or not choose a certain kind of employment. In our own work in ICRW, we've done a study which is ongoing, where we've looked at, what is it that drives women into so-called non-traditional domains and what pushes them to stay in traditional domains. And we find their lives are not very different. There are just 3 factors which set them apart. One is the place of work. When you're going for non-traditional jobs, it's usually at a distance from your home and not close to your home. The second thing is your marital status. It is usually the single women who are in these non-traditional jobs. And the third is the rigidity in terms and conditions of work, which I think we've heard again repetitively on why women are choosing self-employment, why that is the only option. So that was number 1, choice of work. The second thing I think that I would like to dwell upon, which came up a little bit peripherally in some, but I think Purva, you spoke about it, is the household model. And I do want to highlight some recent research that UN Women did where just want to present some data from that. 38% of the households in the world are the kind that you presented, couples living with children kind of households. Almost 30% are families that constitute extended families, including relatives. And I think we can believe that in the global south, we've seen most of those. And almost 10% are lone parent households. So when we think of the household and when we design policies for households, it's important to keep this context in mind as well, in terms of breadwinner and who does what within the household, including the gender division of labor that Farzana referred to, where the role of technology is very well taken. But again, what kind of redistribution is required within those households and between the state and market forces as well to enable different kinds of households. The third thing that I cannot overemphasize, and I think came very strongly in all your presentations, is the institution of marriage and the norms that go around it. I think, Farzana, your presentation spoke very strongly to marriage as a factor in labor force participation. Also, Clément, your presentation spoke to migration as a result of marriage and how the norm of patrilocality is may or may not be affecting women's choice and opportunity to be employed. And again, some data from that same UN Women report says that over 50%, little over 50% married women aged 25 to 54 are in the labor force globally. 2/3 of single women in this age group are in the labor force, compared to 96% of men in the same age group. Right? So these are also the contexts in which we live and work. I think it's important to keep these in mind. Specifically, what does it mean for policy recommendations? I think one of the things that, as many of the feminist collectives that I have been part of, we've really been trying to unpack the question of women's work and employment. And I think we have, one of the things is, if we are talking about work and employment in the same breath, then we are doing injustice to the whole question of gender equality. Because employment is one thing and market work is one thing, but women's work is much more broader than employment. And I think policy has to factor that in, given the kinds of trends we are seeing in today's day and age. The second thing to reflect on, and this has come a little bit from our policy analysis as part of the same study in ICRW that I mentioned earlier, all policies seem to be promoting self-employment, whether it is Skill India, whether it is DDU-GKY, whether it is the NRLM, all of the programs that push women further into an entrepreneurship and self-employment model. What is the message that is going out? It means that stay within the home, do what you can as part of your care burden, and maybe earn a little bit more on the side. And this is the macroeconomic logic that has come in terms of the creation of jobs in our country today, I think. And that's something, at a philosophical level, we should reflect on, that, what is it creating in terms of, women's rights. The other thing that I wanted to say was that I think it's very important to look where women where job opportunities and skills can be provided to women to ensure they enter the labor market, but it's really, really important to also support them where they are. And I cannot overemphasize the need for looking at women in agriculture. I mean, we haven't even started convincing people about feminization of agriculture, that now there is a new discourse on defeminization of agriculture. I think we also do ourselves a lot of injustice by, through this kind of data churning, we should just speak to like 1,000 women in like 30 states and we should figure out what their lives are like. And they are working, okay? They are affected by climate change. There's a lot happening. What can we do to enable their work? Also, what can we do to enable safe migration for them? Because we know they are migrating. More women are migrating than ever before. So I think these are some of the things to keep in mind. I think the Sustainable Development Agenda provides us a useful framework. Unlike the MDGs, which was all about moving from farm to non-farm, I think the SDGs very centrally speak about social, environmental, and economic dimensions of development, which means I think this is, in terms of policy, that's really what we have to look at. And finally, what does the enabling ecosystem look like? Many of you referred to the social norms and barriers that hold women back. And there are certain factors in the ecosystem that I think policy can speak to very directly. And if we're talking about women's work, it has to be beyond labor market solutions. It has to be about provisioning of public services. It has to be energy, like Farzana pointed out. It has to be water supply. It has to be universal social protection. So that's one set of policy recommendations. And the other, which also the speakers pointed towards, is the question of violence and harassment in the world of work. Purva pointed that out right at the beginning. And with the new ILO convention that was recently passed, I think we don't know enough. There is an evidence gap when it comes to understanding what violence and harassment in the world of work looks like. And this is not just the workplace. So again, we are not talking employment alone. We are talking about work and employment in its entirety and the entire world of work where violence and harassment is experienced by women, which is very gendered, and also by some men. So I think these are some of the areas for us to deepen our research moving forward. These are some of the areas to look out for policy recommendations. And yeah, so I think that's all that I had, because I had the presentations in advance, which I did review, but I also heard you all speak, and I felt these were the sort of themes that really, really stood out in terms of the conversation today.
Thank you, Subhalakshmi. So I've been given 5 minutes to add my, my 2 cents. I'm going to try to do that and try to see if there's something I can add that over and above what everyone else has spoken, which is a hard thing to do. But the first point I would make is just on the importance of looking at age and age segmented sort of solutions when we're thinking about both the diagnostic of the problem as well as the kinds of solutions that we want to think about. And certainly the panel is set up in a way to talk about youth and demographic dividend and skilling, but at the same time, I think when it comes to solutions, other than a couple of them that focus on youth like DDU GKY, I think we sort of end up still with very, very overarching, homogeneous kinds of, broad universal policies. And I think, there's a lot of research that talks about marriage and age and so on, but certainly in thinking about aspirations and the match between what Farzana talks about suitable jobs, but even that sort of links with, very, very deep aspirations that different, populations have of their own lives and what their futures must look like. So I think and there is previous rounds of NSS data that does talk about how, aspirations are high and there's a huge mismatch between what youth aspire for and what the labor market looks like. And so there are ways that we must intervene to make sure that those not so much that they align and there has to be this sense of doom, but actually how do we create things that respond to them, but also align and structure them in much more meaningful and realistic ways. A second thing that struck me is this whole question of the quality of work. I think everyone talks, sort of hinted at it, alluded to it, but certainly that's, while the panel itself is not focused on it, I think it's something we can't get away from. I think everyone's talked about this question of informality and what kinds of working conditions are we actually creating, what kinds of jobs get created even when you do have access, when you do build access, and therefore how much of that either turns people away from work or creates the kind of attrition that we're seeing. And I think but there is certainly a huge opportunity to try and see, can we ensure, and 20 years ago we all talked about decent work, and I think that agenda still very much remains. It's not a term that we use as much anymore, but certainly thinking through basic things like minimum wages, conditions of work, hours of work, contracts, maternity benefits. Are there things that we can sort of ensure that new policies are built around ensuring some of this, and figure out what the costs may be. And I think there was some discussion on cumbersome labor legislation, and there is the Labor Department is combining and sort of trying to create these labor codes, but I think this is also where researchers must engage and try to understand the implications of certain kinds of labor codes and what are they sort of trying to pull together, and what do we lose when that kind of aggregation happens across multiple kinds of labor laws that maybe have become kind of obsolete, but are we putting in new efficiencies as well as protection at the same time. A third thing that Subhalakshmi alluded to is this whole focus on microfinance, and that's something we can't get away from in the current climate. It's one of the more well-funded programs is the rural and the urban livelihoods missions, and at the end of the day, while the last many years of those programs have focused on microfinance and financial inclusion, they are they are, livelihoods programs. And so there is a whole focus now on trying to see what kinds of livelihoods can they promote, and even the discourse around NRLM and NULM is now shifting to, more around what do we see in terms of can they be, how can they contribute to labor force participation improvements in India. And I think we can't get away from the fact, of course, that while poor women may be the largest micro borrowers through these programs, they're definitely not the ones accessing formal finance. And so when you see what kinds of entrepreneurs, what kind of finance women entrepreneurs access, less than, I think, 10 to 15% access formal finance. So while women are getting loans and microcredit, they are channeling it into the households, but when it comes to their own businesses, they're far, far more risk averse. And the economic census also tells us that, the size of women's businesses are like 1 to 1.2 or 1.5 workers per enterprise. So these are not even micro, they're like really very, very micro enterprises. And so again, all of this counts towards labor force participation, but then what's the quality of work, what's the quality of capital and services that they're able to access? And not only does India have the third lowest labor force participation in the region, India has the third highest entrepreneurship gap in the world. And so I think that sort of seeming contradictions are where we sort of exist and try to see what can be gained for women. The last point I'll just make is on data and data availability, and even on things like women's enterprises and on cooperatives and collectives. So some of these long-standing forms that we see in the region, I mean, we just don't have very good data on, let's say, how many women's cooperatives exist. And so if you look at Amul, you look at Gujarat, I mean, India does have some pretty well-known large cooperatives, but unlike France, where you have very, very rich data, for example, and France, Italy have pretty large shares of the economy that are coming out of cooperatives and GDP that's coming out of cooperatives. We just don't know this for India. So I think these are some of these, there are bigger, across the board there's large data gaps in terms of what we know and what we could know in order to see where do women go, where do women work, and is it just that we're not counting some of the work that exists out there, but also are we not nurturing and strengthening where women do enter and exit labor markets as a over the life course. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you to all our speakers. I'm going to now turn to the audience, and I believe we have about 20 minutes for a Q&A. So can I see a show of hands? I'm going to bundle 2 or 3 questions, and then yeah, I see several hands on this side, only one hand. Is someone going to pass people a mic? Or? Okay.
My question is, it's that women, among the women also, should the skills should be given more importance, or training should be given more importance? Because when women are trained, that way it is like after a quarter training, the employment rises of women. So it's not necessary that for each and every woman after the same amount of training should the employment rise. So is that we should emphasize more or focus more on training or on skills?
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I'm basically an environmental economist, but I have a query combining Purva's paper and Clément's paper. Purva, you said that we have a high elasticity when it comes to women's work, and in case if you try and kind of make initiatives, the work gap worsens for women. Between male-female kind of worsens. Clément, your paper had a very strong suggestion, which is a very good suggestion, because we actually also see that that if we transfer or we kind of push young females or younger section from the rural to the urban area, then we can try and figure out the employment issue concerns. My question is that if we kind of study both of these papers parallelly, both of these have come up with very good suggestions, but shifting younger force from rural to urban, wouldn't that further trigger the elasticity factor and maybe result in a worsening of the work gap ratio between male-female? And ma'am, I just have another question that I want to add to it. So looking at the current economic trends, joblessness or the unemployment factor has been going up. And looking at what sort of elasticity factor women have shown in work scenario, we can kind of make an inference that women would probably suffer a little more than the men in this scenario. So with the upcoming economic crunch, which is expected to worsen over time, would you suggest any of the policy suggestions to overcome specifically joblessness targeting in the female section, whether urban or whether rural? Thank you so much.
Can we just get some responses and then go back, since we now have 3 questions? So I'm going to ask, I guess one was targeted to both of you and the other is probably across the...
It's interesting. I can say I'm trying to... do you want to... Or, no. So the way I understood the question, maybe then we can take it both of us, was that if you move many young rural female workers to urban areas, what will that do to, I guess, wages and then employment opportunities in urban areas and for the economy as a whole? So it's a good question.
Good question, yes.
Do you want to?
I think if I think of in terms of, and I think Clément touched upon this a bit, that when you saw migration from rural to urban areas, it didn't help the women, right? They were not able, it didn't get them good employment. So that is very similar to what you see in my paper. What you would be doing is that you're increasing the labor supply when females move from the rural to urban area. But so firms are getting a higher supply of female labor, so they can employ those females at lower wages now because there's higher supply. But there's not enough decent formal job creation. So unless there are decent good jobs being created, either you would see that females do not want to take up those jobs, or that they, if there is a big supply, that they move to urban areas, that they would have to take up low-paying informal jobs, or they would not find an employment, which is what exactly Clément's paper also showed, that the migration didn't really help.
So I'd be a bit more positive. I agree with the mechanism, but I'd be a bit more positive about this particular program, because this particular program makes it very clear that it's finding work in formal jobs in employers who've been vetted, and so decent work conditions, and actually there's a minimum wage, so they can't get under. So this part, I would say, this particular program actually makes sure to place those women in relatively good condition. That said, and just to come back to the more macro picture, it is true that women are accepting lower job than men. Actually, what we see is that men move out of these relatively low-paying jobs and are moving out to better job opportunities, and women don't. And then, of course, there's the macro angle, which is to say, well, if wages go down, there'll be employment creation, but maybe employment creation of a lower quality.
So again, like as Clément said, this was a particular program where they were given the opportunity to take up these formal sector jobs. So either that's one way that you have such programs, but at a larger scale, this might not be possible. And then again, that's where the role of policymakers come in, to make sure that there are enough decent jobs for people being created.
Thanks. So the other question was, do we need training or skilling? So I'll let you take that.
I realize I'm taking lots of time. I just say it's a bit complicated to know what those trainings are doing, because this is a training plus placement. So it's a program that does both things. It's training those women, say, to stitch a bit on a machine, and then it's sending them to a factory. What exactly is happening, whether it's about skill building or whether it's about matching with employer, that's a bit unclear, right? So that's I think where the question is.
I'm gonna.
Development of practice and everything. So
I have an interesting statistic that might be useful over
survey that we were doing in Delhi, we found that more women said that they had got a diploma or training. So, and of those, let's say both men and women, husbands and wives, we were surveying, who'd got diploma and training, 75% of the men are working, but only 25% of the women are working. We don't know exactly when they got it. I haven't checked in the data to see when they got their diploma or training. But then even conditional on being trained, the probability that a woman is working is lower than it is for men.
Can I, could I just request you to, sorry, I'm just going to use my chair's prerogative and say, let's take that follow-up offline. I think there'll be time after this session to interact with the speakers. But I'm going to just quickly ask maybe Farzana to respond to this last question on what's the solution, what is...
It wasn't asked to me, so
I know,
it's okay.
but I thought you didn't have enough time.
I'm happy if you want to take other questions.
Okay,
yeah.
so why don't we take 2 more questions, but maybe we can come back to a final round of remarks from all of you.
Yeah,
and may I request you to please keep your questions really short so that we can hear more from the speakers. Maybe 2 questions from here, sorry, just being fair and not chronological in this. If there's a couple of questions from here. Anyone's, okay, sorry. Yeah.
This is for the entire panel. So would you attribute the declining decadal rate of women participation of labor force in rural areas to the decreasing priority given to Manrega in the last decade? And number 2 is, would you think that...
One question, please.
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to somebody else.
So there was 2 points. One was about the labor. There are about 250 labor laws was told. And on the other hand, women don't find safe enough in formal work settings. This seems to be counterintuitive. Are we saying 250 labor laws are not enough, or they're not implemented properly, or what is the role as a policy maker to intervene so that 250 laws are either reduced or better implemented? So where's the gap?
Okay. Let's take 1 more question and then we'll come back to the speakers.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Jai Prakash. My question is related to that. As you mentioned that most of them are women are engaged in the informal sector. So do you have the categories which type of women, your general or backward classes and all? Just I would like to know that one. Okay. So if you have the data, please let me know. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to the panel and let you choose which ones you want to speak to, but potentially maybe start with Purva, so that. And then others can speak to the others. Yeah.
So I think I'll answer the question on your question on whether whether women find it safe at work and whether and the labor laws that that might be contradicting each other. But by labor laws, what I was referring to is the labor laws such as the Industrial Disputes Act, as well as various other regulations which make it very difficult or hinder firms from or make them scared to hire workers formally. So for instance, if they want to dismiss workers, if they have beyond 100 workers, it's very difficult for them to do that because they have to get government permission. Or if they want to shut down a firm, it's very, very difficult to get permission to do that. So they have to keep paying wages to workers even though the factory might not be functioning. And even if you look at the strike to lockout ratio, it's very high in India. By women's safety, that's a different issue. That doesn't really come, I wouldn't put that in the same category as what I was at least referring to. So for women's safety, you have sexual harassment at work act, you have anti-discriminatory laws as well. They are all there. It's just that I think there's not enough implementation or awareness of it as well, that should be more properly implemented. So I don't see a contradiction between the two, but yeah.
Well, I think on Narega and the effect on women labor force participation, I'm going to give it to Farzana, who's done work on this. So.
Yeah, and absolutely when you see NREGA has had a positive impact on women's labor force participation. So I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind that has led to an increase in participation of women in rural areas for 2 reasons that Clément pointed out. One is equal wages for men and women, and secondly that 30% of those jobs are reserved for women. And so work that I've done shows that, just bringing work closer to women's home when accessibility is an issue is going to see a big jump in women's labor force participation, and that speaks to the concerns also about safety. So I think safety is also a bigger issue. It's not just at workplace, but also safety on way to work, on accessing work. So I think what we were talking about earlier about public transport, public services, availability of those are important for women to access work. And just for this one point on safety in formal work, I think all informal work is not worse than formal work. I think we should not take it, our conclusion from here shouldn't be that we should move women from informal work to formal work because necessarily formal work is better. It isn't. So as I was saying, in the work that we are doing in Delhi, in looking at what women are experiencing within factories, there is a lot of concern about issues within the workplace, if you want to call that formal, right? Like it's a contractual work, you're doing a 9-to-5 job, but still these women want to get out of the factories and they prefer to go to construction sites. They might prefer to peddle stuff on the road, right? And that's because it's not safe to be within these factories, or there are other work environment that is, as it exists, is not conducive to women being there. So all informal work is not bad and all formal work is not good.
All right, so we have 2 minutes left.
2 points to that. One is not just is informal work not bad. I think the policy response has been if it's available for the formal sector, it should be available for the informal sector. I think that response is also faulty therefore. And I think it has to be looked at in the larger continuum of women's paid and unpaid work, what are the enabling conditions that need to be in place, which is why I said move beyond labor market solutions. And the second thing on Narega, because I was actively part of that campaign when it came into, it became an act, and after it became an act, I think the other very fundamental point of difference between Narega and everything else was that people were suddenly counted as citizens, women were suddenly, the shift in their mind that we are rights holders and therefore we have a right to work is very different from, oh, somebody is giving me some charity. And I think it may seem as a policy maker or a researcher, so what, but fundamentally that affects the uptake of any policy, is if there is dignity and rights enshrined in that policy.
Thanks, Subhalakshmi. So I'm going to do a quick last rapid fire round, and I'm going to start with Purva. I'm going to just say, what's your top 2 levers that you think that we need to boost women's labor force participation? Just top 2 levers.
I think one would be safety. I think that is very important, and as Farzana reminded me that it's not only
just
at the
keep
workplace.
It short so that she's
so
telling me we got 2 minutes about 5 minutes ago. So
I think safety and of course appropriate skill training and higher education.
Great, thanks, Clément.
It's hard to come up with
skills.
Yeah, no. So, okay, skills are interesting and important. No, I think the creation of those of safe jobs is interesting because I've also have worked. I'll do it short, but I've also have worked in China, and the picture when you compare India and China is just dramatic. And the labor force participation of women in China is the same as the one of men, and they are doing all these factory jobs.
Great.
And that's not.
Farzana.
Again, I mean, it's really hard, but what I would think is that no matter how educated the woman might be, or no matter how good the opportunities for work outside might be, but if you don't get away from these norms which, impose the time constraints on women at home, we are not going to be able to get them to be in the market and be productive.
Great. Subhalakshmi, last word.
The enabling ecosystem and whatever it takes, ending violence, redistributing unpaid work, whatever it takes. Create an enabling ecosystem where women feel respected and, take the rightful place as they should.
Well, thank you to all the panelists and thank you to the audience. I know I disappointed people with not coming to you for your questions. Please happily feel free to hound the speakers and thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well, let me just take a few minutes now in closing to do a couple of things. First, I want to thank all of those who have made this possible, this event. I'm not going to succeed in naming all the people who've made big contributions, but I want to single out first the local team here in IGC, IGC India, based in Delhi, but also the team based in Patna, who've had a huge role in today, but also in this week's events, which we're just coming to the close of. I want to thank also the IGC hub staff, that's the London-based staff, who have both come here, but then of course been very involved in the advanced planning. So I hope you all join me in giving them a big round of applause. And then let me just say that from my perspective, I think today's conference exceeded my expectations in our aim, which was to try to provide a stimulus to debate on certain critical policy issues, growth policy issues facing India. I think we had a very stimulating set of sessions throughout the day. And let me, at the risk of having important omissions, just single out a couple of the things from each of the sessions that have struck me as particularly important. We started off by talking about social protection, and I think began with a provocative presentation which talked about the need to think about the fundamental determinants of the poverty trap, and that sort of leading to two important conclusions. One, when we're thinking about social protection, we need to think about the production side and not just the consumption side, that it's only by increasing individuals' productivity that in the long run we can move them out of poverty. But then also how we do that may have important implications for the nature of delivery of cash transfers, i.e. you may need a big push rather than consistent low levels of support over time. But we are also reminded by other presentations that we have a number of different objectives that we try to achieve through social protection. And we mustn't lose sight of nutritional and other sorts of objectives that we have that the market may not solve, and and therefore there may be good reasons to try to combine both consumption-oriented transfers and production-oriented transfers, and we may need to think about how we integrate those. And I think finally that India is a very exciting place to be studying these questions, that there's a lot of reform going on, there's a lot of attention to these issues, and I think it's a very fertile ground for further research, and we're very keen at IGC to be funding that. The second session was about electricity and should it be a right. And we began with a sort of discussion about the importance of norms and how the belief that electricity is an entitlement, is a right, can prevent meaningful progress in increasing access to electricity. We talked about ways in which that sort of vicious circle might be broken. We also saw that some really innovative attempts to increase energy access succeeded in part, but not completely. We saw that there were some quite strong effects from changing the load shedding strategy of the regulatory agency, and that by funneling more electricity to those with high payment rates improved the revenue position of the distribution companies. But we didn't see quite this as strong a behavioral response on the part of the households as we might have liked to see. So clearly challenges remain. We also saw that once you introduce other sources of power into the equation, whether that's solar or diesel or whatever, we have a more complicated situation, and probably one in which we need to think carefully through all of these different marginal incentives. And to make matters even worse, there's a big difference between what might be optimal in the short run from what might be optimal in the long run. So policy needs to think about those and how the two of those connect. And then, of course, there's a whole range of political economy issues that get laid right on top of all this, with the magnitude of subsidies and how those might be reduced over time. Our third session was on climate change, pollution, and growth. Is that the third word? But anyway, and I think one of the things the chair did really very effectively was say we need to think about these three in an integrated way. I think we started off with very compelling evidence about the serious challenges posed by climate change and the need for urgent action there. But then equally a recognition that we have a difficult set of trade-offs to make between three very important goals. One is to reduce the risks of climate change, but another is that India faces really very serious problems of local pollution and the health damage and that we now know is very concrete and very severe. But all of that, again, has to be balanced against the absolutely essential role of energy in growth and in driving up incomes over time. So we need to think about solutions that balance these three goals. How do we do that? Well, we need to think about effective instruments. The role of pricing and carbon pricing was one thing which was debated in the panel. Equally, the role of regulation and whether forcing changes in behavior, as we've done with lighting, with light bulbs and in other ways, would be more effective. Interestingly, one of the speakers then linked action against local pollution as potentially one of the most powerful ways to address the climate change question. If we can successfully introduce cap and trade for particulates, as is now going to happen in Gujarat, that we might be able to use that as a way to make serious progress towards climate change. But then we were also reminded that we, particularly we as economists, have to look beyond prices and quantities sometimes and the role of land titling and the potential benefits of transferring land titles to indigenous people as a way to prevent deforestation was highlighted. And we finished with a very rich final session on gender skills and migration issues. I think had started off with a very striking evidence of India as an outlier, a negative outlier in terms of women's labor force participation, even when you control for education. And not only that, but that it's gotten worse, that labor force participation has declined significantly in the past several decades. So the speakers then sort of began to unpack that for us, talked about both issues in labor supply, where again the issue of norms surfaces very importantly, but also a lot of attention on that on the labor supply side was devoted to issues of safety and mobility. On the other hand, there are clearly important issues of labor demand as well, clear evidence of discrimination, also of the negative effects of regulation on labor demand. A lot of attention was devoted to the issue of the quality of work as being important. We can't focus, again, simply on wages and hours. We need to think about the quality of work, and that includes violence and harassment, but also the nature of the work, in formal versus informal. The chair, the moderator, made the very important point that a key obstacle to progress in the area is data availability, and that's something that needs to be addressed. All of that made a fairly dark picture, but we did also talk about solutions and some really, I think, encouraging things. One is we were pointed in the direction of technology as one source of solutions, the LPG studies being one evidence. I know from other areas of IGC work that, phones, and particularly smartphones, can facilitate matching and reduce frictions in labor markets, and there are going to be some possibilities there for technology improving things. We also saw how government regulatory approaches, and NREGA as an example, which enforced equal opportunities, and not only that, but quotas, has been very useful, and we see that women respond in those circumstances and take up the opportunities. We saw migration's not an easy thing to unpack. A lot of migrations is driven by marriage, and that then, of course, gives a different picture than migration for work reasons. But where there have been programs aimed at encouraging that migration with training and placement programs, there's evidence that those programs can improve both employment levels, but also the quality of work. And I think finally, as we found in all of the sessions, we got a sense of the importance of taking into account the choices that women face and the need to think about those really in a coherent way in terms of being able to then develop effective policies. So I think a very, very rich day in terms of both giving us new ideas, but also challenging us, I think, in terms of some of the ways we've been thinking about these issues that are now being confronted by new evidence that forces us to rethink. And I think all of that came from both the very talented speakers we had, but also from all of you in the audience. We had great questions and very lively back and forth in the Q&A sessions. I'm sorry only that we didn't have more time, but of course that was a trade-off in terms of trying to cover a number of different topics in the course of the day. So let me just finish with a big thank you to all of you, both the speakers, but also you as the audience, for joining us today to celebrate 10 years of IGC. Thanks very much.